Part 57. The Prince is Very Fierce. Author, Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 561. After running around all night, the wind and snow gradually stopped, the east turned white, and the morning sun shone on the tens of thousands of peach trees in Pinggu's peach blossom sea, making the sky and earth white. The outside world is full of soldiers, and the rivers, lakes, and markets are as silent as the grass and trees. However, the canyon hidden in the deep mountains and old forests seems to be isolated from the world, and the sea is calm and there is no movement at all. The earth stove next to it went out at some point, and the temperature slowly dropped. Su Buling was in a daze when he heard the soft creak of the house opposite. Light footsteps came from the house and stopped at the door, as if he was peeking through the crack in the door to see what was going on here. Su Buling was too tired last night and did not wake up because there was no danger. But after a moment, the door opened and a figure walked out. Su Buling held the handle of the knife with his left hand and squinted his eyes, only to see a woman in a jingchai sarong walking out of the small room. She was not a shambling old woman. She looked not very old. She has willow leaf eyebrows, auspicious eyes, lips as thin and small as cherry blossoms, and her cheeks look a bit weak like Lu Fuifeng's. Her long black hair is simply coiled on her head. She wears a dark blue top and a pleated skirt with white flowers on a blue background. The fabric is relatively old and has some signs of wear and tear from daily work. Although there is no makeup, she looks very elegant, and her clothes are clean and tidy. Well, a very handsome village girl. It seemed that the phoenix emerging from the mountains was not a lie. From the look in his footsteps, Su Buling could see that the other party did not know martial arts, so he was no longer wary. He lay down and pretended to sleep, hoping to wait for the little village girl to run away before leaving, so as not to scare others. After all, he is only wearing pants and looks like a savage in turf. The little village girl was not tall. She hid a pair of scissors behind her back. She walked into the courtyard and cautiously looked around for a few times. When she saw that the person who broke in last night was still there, she turned pale with fright and moved lightly. Go back. After walking a few steps, she found the black dog lying in the kennel, not knowing whether it was alive or dead. The little village girl's eyes showed a bit of anger. She turned around and held up her skirt. She slowly walked to the door of the kitchen and picked up the little black dog. And then walked back, for fear of waking up the robber lying in the woodpile. Su Buling didn't open his eyes, but he heard the movements clearly. He held his breath and remained motionless, slowly waiting for others to leave. But the little village girl retreated to the center of the courtyard and stopped for a moment when she saw the man lying in the firewood pile who didn't even seem to be breathing. After looking carefully for a few times, he probably thought he was dead, so he came back, took a wooden stick from under the eaves to support the window, carefully entered the kitchen, squatted in front of the earthen stove, and gently poked Su Buling with the wooden stick. Ling's legs. Su Buling closed his eyes, but he didn't know how to deal with it. If he woke up directly, he would probably scare this lonely little village girl to death. If she didn't wake up. The little village girl squatted and moved a little closer, and poked a few more times with a small wooden stick. Hello. The voice is light and soft, and the throat is as graceful as a lark, but for some reason, it sounds a little childish. Could it be that he is mentally retarded? It doesn't look like it. Su Buling felt rather embarrassed. He didn't want to scare others, so he left the money and left. But this little village girl was quite naive. When she poked him for a while and saw no response, she was so frightened that she dropped the stick on the ground. She stood up and clasped her hands on her chest, as if she was thinking of a countermeasure. Su Buling hesitated for a moment, and in order to reduce his threat, he prepared to take a weak breath and look like he was seriously injured, so as to prevent the other party from panicking. Unexpectedly, before he made a weak gesture, the little village girl thought of a solution. She turned back to the courtyard, took a hoe from the corner of the house, ran to the snow outside the fence, and started digging a hole. It looked like he wanted to bury the dead person directly. Su Buletinling's eyes were full of astonishment, and he thought to himself, burying him without even taking a breath to make sure he was dead was too simple. It would obviously be inappropriate to wait for a helpless girl to finish digging a hole before digging a hole. Su Buling thought for a while and had to say, ahem, and coughed twice weakly to indicate that he was not dead yet. The sound of coughing came out, and the sound of throwing away the hoe came back. The figure of the little village girl appeared quickly, and ran into the house in panic. However, when passing by the kitchen, she found that Su Buling had already been weak and stood up. He must have found her, so he turned around and ran out again. It doesn't seem like he's mentally retarded. Su Buling secretly breathed a sigh of relief, quickly raised his hand, and said in a weak voice, "Girl, I'm not a bad person, I know you were hiding in the cellar last night, I'm really sorry." This consolation was obviously very useful. After hearing this, the little village girl stopped in her tracks, turned around and glanced weakly, and only after making sure that Su Buling couldn't run could she turn around. "Who are you? Who asked you to come here? Get out quickly." His tone was very fierce, but his weak Lu Fuifeng-like face and figure made it difficult for people to feel the slightest threat or momentum. Su Buring nodded, stood up with difficulty holding the knife, put on a white robe, took out a banknote and placed it on the stove, with a bit of apology. "I really disturbed the girl. I rested here last night and made some food by the way. This money is considered as compensation for the girl, so I hope you can accept it." With that said, he walked out of the kitchen and walked outside the fence. The little village girl's eyes were wary and she put the scissors behind her waist. After Su Buling left the door, she moved her steps and quickly ran to the kitchen. She glanced around a few times and her eyes showed a bit of anxiety. She took the banknote and spoke again. "Ran out. Wait." Su Buletinling paused, turned around, and said with a smile, "You're welcome, girl, this little money is nothing to me." Before she finished speaking, the little village girl showed a little annoyed and interjected, "You've finished eating the rice, what will I eat? What's the use of my money?" Su Buling was stunned for a moment, looked at him doubtfully, and took a moment to react. "Yes, look at this place. This little village girl probably rarely goes out and doesn't have much money to spend. Yesterday's food stock was obviously not much. The food of poor people was basically good. If it was wasted, it would be difficult to survive until next autumn harvest. The small amount of food in the rice vat, he thought it was a few months' reserve. According to his appetite, I guess I ate the girl's rations for 10 days last night, and even gave her the only meat she had to eat. Well." Su Buletinling's expression froze slightly and he looked at the black dog next to him. The little village girl quickly moved to block the black dog. "It catches fish for me, and it also needs to eat. If it doesn't have food, it will starve to death. Why do you eat my food?" Su Buletinling's expression was slightly embarrassed. Judging from the distance of his escape last night, there was probably no human habitation within dozens of miles. The mountains are blocked by heavy snow and hunting is impossible. What should we do? Their eyes met, and there was a slight stalemate. Su Buling finally made up his mind and thought for a while, how about I go out to buy food and deliver it to the girl?" The village girl frowned slightly, hesitated, and shook her head. "No, it's such a long way. If you go out, you won't come back. You're lying to me." Su Buling looked a little helpless and spread his hands. "I will keep my word and will never lie to you. I will definitely come back when I go out. How about I leave the sword here?" The little village girl obviously didn't trust the stranger, but she still shook her head. "I can't follow you, you ran away, what's the use of my sword? I only have an axe to chop down trees." Su Buling estimated that this little village girl had been away from social life for too long, and her speech logic seemed to be different from other people's. He thought for a while and said with a smile, "I can't buy food if I don't go out. If I stay here, 2 people will eat your food. So it will be consumed faster." The little village girl stood in front of the kitchen and thought for a moment, then raised her slender finger and pointed to the river in the distance. "You need to catch fish for me, enough for 10 days, and 13 pieces of firewood. You can't find the oil, salt, and wine. You can replace it with 10 fish. You have to cut a new pair of bowls and chopsticks for me. I don't want the ones you used thing." Su Buring blinked. He didn't expect that the little village girl knew so well. Firewood, bowls, and chopsticks were easy to talk about, but where could he catch fish in the winter? The little village girl saw Su Buling's embarrassed look and pursed her lips. She seemed to have remembered the current situation and was afraid that Su Buling would become angry because of embarrassment, so she said again, "Forget it if you don't want to. I won't argue with you. You are not allowed to come back after you go out, and you are not allowed to let outsiders come over. A gentleman should be careful about his independence. No one may know about his refusal to eat other people's food, but his virtue is obviously more important than a meal." Su Buletinling thought for a moment and realized that nothing would happen to Chu Chu and the others with Lu Baiming around. Juju was an expert in concealing her whereabouts. She couldn't even find him if she hid. She was not in a hurry, so she nodded lightly. "I'll go take a look in the river. 20 fish should be enough, right? If you want big fish, you are not allowed to catch fry." Okay." Su Buling nodded, stepped out of the fence, and turned back. "Do you have a fishing rod? If you don't have any bait, dig up earthworms yourself." Su Buling sighed and walked out of the neat sapling forest with his sword in hand. The little village girl stood in the courtyard. Seeing Su Buling walking further and further away, she shouted again, "If you want to come back, don't lie to others." With a helpless expression, Su Buletinling inserted the drunken bamboo sword on the ground with the scabbard, took out the peace sign from his master from his waist and hung it on it, raised the sword and walked away slowly on the knee-deep snow. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 562. The warm winter sun shines in the canyon, and the river surface is sparkling. In the gentle pools, the pebbles on the bottom of the water are clearly visible, making people unable to even feel the existence of water. Throwing dead leaves into the water seems to be suspended in mid-air, only at the bottom of the water. Leaving behind a piece of privacy is a shadow that can clearly see the context. If the water is clear, there will be no fish. Su Buling stood on the shore with his hands on his hips, a look of helplessness on his face. The water view in front of him was beautiful and refreshing, but this was obviously not what he wanted to see. With such clear water, it's unclear whether fish can be seen in summer, let alone in the coldest month of winter. However, fish don't come and go in autumn. No matter how cold the weather is, there will always be some, but it's just hard to find them. When Su Buring was in Chang'an City, he often went fishing at the waterside pavilion in Qujiangpan to pass the time. He was considered a half-fisherman and knew nothing about it. When fishing in winter, pay attention to fishing quietly but not fishing. Fish like to stay in places with gentle water flow. The temperature is too low and they are unwilling to move. There must be bunkers around to avoid being attacked by natural enemies. Most of them are hidden in caves or under big rocks. Su Buring walked slowly by the water with his sword in hand, paying careful attention to the movements in the river. He walked for 2 miles, and during the process he found a flat stone placed diagonally by the river, with a small stone next to it as the stool should be where the little village girl usually washes her clothes. A trail extends from the river to the depths of Peach Blossom Valley. After walking through it many times, the trail has been smoothed out. There is also a crooked path next to it. You can vaguely see a few plum blossom footprints, which should have been stepped by the little black dog. Just by looking at these traces, one can imagine that in a deep mountain valley, a woman holding a wooden basin is walking through a path with long grass and warblers, and the dog next to her is wagging its tail and circling around. Since the little village girl just now, his tone and demeanor were guessing, and he would probably also give a few words like "What are you doing? Be honest and don't run around." Su Buling looked at the isolated canyon surrounded by mountains, and was a little curious about how a woman's family could survive in such an extremely lonely situation. It was Manzi, in this canyon where there was no sound of wind. "Just wait, I'm afraid I'll go crazy in less than 3 days. After searching along the river for a long time, I finally found a relatively deep pool in the river. There were gaps under some boulders next to the pool. It was probably the only place where fish could be hidden." Su Buling stopped, took off his boots, tied the hem of his robe around his waist, entered the cold river water, pulled out the sword Shang Chunqingyi had given him, and began to slowly grope under the boulder. Outside the fence, hundreds of saplings are neatly arranged. The saplings near the fence are already shoulder high, and their bare branches are covered with layers of snowflakes. They are already considered small trees. The outermost row is knee-high saplings, which look great in winter. They look like small branches stuck in the ground, and the latest row is just dug holes, obviously prepared in advance for planting trees in spring. Hundreds of saplings are arranged in a straight line, no matter whether you look at it from front to back, left or right, and there is no misalignment in the slightest. But at this time, among the neat saplings, there was a straight knife inserted in the ground. The scabbard was bamboo green. From a distance, it looked like one of the hundreds of saplings had grown crookedly. Xiaokan held a hoe and dug a small hole in the frozen mud. He was not very strong and was digging very slowly. Every time he dug a few times, he would turn his head to look at the straight knife inserted in the nursery. "It's not because I have any interest in knives or outsiders, it's just that it feels very awkward and an eyesore. Just like the thousands of white stone floor tiles in the square, one of them is made of bluestone. The more you look at it, the more uncomfortable it becomes. You can't help but want to take out the wrong color tile and replace it with the same one." There is silence in the canyon, not even the chirping of birds in winter, like an eternal ink painting. And that straight knife that suddenly appeared was like an ink dot stained on the spotless painting. The little village girl dug for a while, then stopped with a slight breath. Maybe she couldn't bear it anymore. She leaned the hoe against the peach tree, trotted to the straight knife, took out a handkerchief from her arms and wrapped it in her hand. He pulled out the straight knife and buried it, but just as he stretched out his hand, he looked in the direction where the outsider left. What if that person really comes back? The little village girl stood next to the straight knife and thought for a moment, then put away her skirt and squatted down to collect the snow under the peach tree. After a long time, she built a big snowman. The snowman was as high as a straight knife. After the little village girl finished heaping it, she warmed her cold red hands and ran back to the hoe. She took a closer look at the height difference. She could see over the top of the snowman's head as high as a knife and see what was behind. The half-hilt is even more abrupt. The little village girl's eyes were obviously angry. She ran to the snowman again and piled a hair crown on top of the snowman's head. It was a tasseled crown common among children of aristocratic families. The clothes and crown were integrated, and the hair crown alone didn't look right, so I used my fingers to draw a sloping collar and belt on the snowman's body. After finishing the work, the little village girl ran back to the hoe again and took a closer look. The snowman and the snow blended into one, the peach forest was neat and tidy, and finally the unsightly knife could not be seen. The little village girl smiled with satisfaction and picked up the hoe again. The sun and the moon go by, and the morning light turns into the sunset. On the path in the forest, Su Buring was carrying a Qingfeng longsword on his shoulder. There was a strip of cloth hanging on the top of the scabbard. Under the strip of cloth, there were 7 fish with unknown names. The fish needed to be fattened for the winter, so they were quite fat. They had been killed by the river, their internal organs removed, and they were washed clean. After working in the river for a whole day, I only caught 7 big fish. It took more effort than dealing with Situyuejin and Chendeazai. However, in this winter, I still had a good harvest, and I felt a sense of accomplishment. Woof woof. Just as he walked far away from the house, a dog barked. Within a moment, the little black dog that had been knocked unconscious in the early morning rushed out fiercely. When he saw Su Buling walking over, he was a little dazed for a moment, and then quickly pinched him. He ran back with his tail on his tail. Su Buling said sorry secretly in his heart and walked into the forest full of peach trees. When he looked up, he saw the drunken bamboo knife stuck in place and a big snowman beside him. Huh! Su Buling was stunned for a moment, then walked up to him and looked at it carefully. The snowman was very delicately built, with round sides that were symmetrical. Everything from the hair crown to the boots was meticulous. It was obvious that a lot of thought had been put into it. Looking at his attire, the long robe and jade belt with a vertical crown, it looks somewhat similar to him. What's the meaning? Su Buling blinked, feeling a little flattered for a moment. He didn't have much contact with the little village girl, and her personality was a little weird. Su Buling couldn't figure out why he was piled into a snowman and put here. However, this behavior seemed to him to be well-intentioned, well, a simple and kind-hearted village girl. Su Buletinling raised a smile at the corner of his mouth, thought for a moment, put a smile on the snowman's face, and then walked into the fenced yard with the fish in hand. Click! Click! The soft sound of wooden looms running came from the main room of 3 small rooms. The door was open. From the courtyard, you could see the looms and spindles on the left side of the room. On the right side was a small long table. There were several wooden boxes stacked neatly on top of each other. The little village girl was sitting on a stool and weaving cloth carefully, as if she was thinking about something. Her side face showed a hint of worry, and she had a somewhat weak face. From a distance, she looked pitiful, and easily felt protective. Under the stool, the black dog lay trembling. After seeing Su Buling, he quickly bit the skirt and pulled it. The little village girl came back to her senses at this time. She turned her head and found Su Buling standing in the courtyard with a panic look on her face. She stood up, took a few steps back, and picked up the scissors on the table. With a gentle smile on his face, Su Buling raised the 7 big fat fish in his hand, looking slightly embarrassed. Girl, there are few fish in the river. It took me a long time to find a place and I only caught 7. If we go back tomorrow, we should be able to get enough. The little village girl looked at the big fish in Su Buling's hand, thought for a moment, and said crisply, "You also need to eat. If you eat my food for 10 days in one meal, it will only become less and less. You'd better leave." Well. Su Buletinling's expression froze. What he said made sense. He couldn't catch fish for a whole day without eating. As long as he ate, he would owe more and more, and he would never be able to pay it back. Su Buling thought for a while, took out a few biscuits from behind his belt, and said with a smile, "I brought some dry food. Just eat less fish and make do. Girl, don't worry." The little village girl frowned slightly, "Then why didn't you eat dry food last night and insisted on eating my food?" Su Buling spread his hands, "Because the dry food doesn't taste good." The little village girl was speechless for a moment. Without saying anything more, she walked to the door and closed it. "You sleep in the firewood house. You have to make up for me as much firewood as you need. You also have to cut out the bowls and chopsticks. I ate the rice with a spoon today. Also, you are not allowed to stick the knife in the ground. If you want to, you can. Insert farther." Well. Su Buletinling turned his head and looked at the snowman and the straight knife in the distance, slightly confused. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 563. The setting sun hangs on the top of the mountain, and the canyon is dyed with a light golden color against the setting sun. In the kitchen, Su Buling hung the freshly caught fish on the window. It could be preserved for some time in the cold winter. As long as he eats fish in these 10 days, the food problem will be solved. We have found a fish nest today and expect to catch a lot of fish tomorrow. The dry food he brought was only enough to fill his stomach. Su Buring still took a fish, took out firewood and a small stool from the kitchen, and piled them on the courtyard dam. He lit a fire near the melon stand, used wooden sticks to thread the fish and roasted it on the fire. Then he sat in front of him, holding a log and carefully cutting it with his sword. With Su Buling's martial arts, it was easy to carve out a bowl. The burning bonfire made a soft pop sound, echoing the loom in the house. The aroma of grilled fish spread quickly, and the puppy in the house must have smelled it. It pulled open the wooden door behind the door and let out a woohoo sound. As it grew dark, the light in the room was probably too dark, and the loom stopped. After a moment of silence in the main room, the door opened, and the black dog jumped out and ran to the bonfire. At this time, he was no longer afraid of Su's orders. He stared at the grilled fish and drooled. It was obvious that the food he usually ate was not good. Su Buling thought for a while and turned his head to look at the main room. Girl, are you hungry? I will catch more fish tomorrow. The fire is lit, so I can grill 2 more. The little village girl stood inside the door. After looking at it for a few times, she slowly walked out. I bake it myself. 1 strip is enough for me and it. Then he walked into the kitchen, took down a fish, tied it with a stick, walked to the opposite side of the fire, and held the stick in both hands to grill it seriously. Su Buling was cutting wood and looked up. He felt that it was a bit strange to stand so stupidly, so he dragged the lounge chair under the melon stand over. Sit back and bake. The little village girl didn't refuse. She walked to the deck chair, turned the deck chair half a turn, with the back of the chair facing Su Buling, then lay on it, stretched out the wooden stick to grill the fish, and swayed leisurely. Seeing this, Su Buling shook his head and smiled. He has always judged people very accurately, and his behavior and thoughts can be traced. He can basically understand their personality and temper in just a few sentences. But this little village girl made him a little confused. She always felt like a retard, and her words and actions were abnormal, but when he thought about it carefully, there was nothing wrong with her. She was just weird anyway. The black dog squatted in the middle, and the two were silent for a moment. Su Buletinling thought for a while and then spoke first. Girl, why do you live alone in this deep mountain and forest? The little village girl rocked the recliner and said in a not very polite tone, I want to live here, so I'll live here. Look at the oil, salt, and utensils in the kitchen. You haven't lived here since you were a child. Did your family bring them to you, or did you go out and buy them yourself? You talk too much. I don't like talking. Su Buletinling nodded, sighed softly, and shut up silently. Soon, the red sun completely sank on the top of the mountain, the sky and the earth turned completely dark. The sky was clear and snowy, the sky was full of stars and a crescent moon hung in the sky. Su Buling raised his head and realized that the beauty in the canyon was a bit dreamy, so he secretly pinched himself to make sure he was not floating in the river and passed out. He was already on his deathbed and was in a hallucination. The little village girl was also looking at the starry sky. After a long time, she suddenly stretched out her grilled fish and pointed to a very bright star in the west. Hey, do you know what that star is called? Su Buling raised his head and glanced. There is Kaiming in the east and Chang'an in the west. It should be the Chang'an star. The little village girl poked her eyes out from the side of the chair, looking slightly surprised. Have you read the Book of Songs? Su Buling had already seen from her words and deeds that this little village girl was not a country fool. At this time, it seemed that she had probably read a lot of books. He nodded. The 4 books and 5 classics are required courses, so I have naturally read them. Then can you compose poetry? Su Buring blinked, shook his head and chuckled. I don't know how to write poems, but I have memorized quite a few. The little village girl seemed to be very interested in this. She turned her chair half a circle, held the grilled fish in both hands, sat with her elbows on her knees, and tilted her head to look at it carefully. Which ones have you memorized? Let me see if you remember correctly. Su Buling was a little amused. He thought for a moment and looked at the thousands of peach trees outside the fence that stretched to the end of his field of vision. Peach Blossom Temple in Dawao, Peach Blossom Ferry under Peach Blossom Temple. As soon as she read these 2 sentences, the little village girl frowned and shook the grilled fish. You don't have this poem, you're lying. Su Buling naturally knew that there was no such poem, and he explained softly, in the past 2 years, a talented man from the south of the Yangtze River just wrote it. It has become popular all over the country and is very famous. It is normal for girls here not to care about the outside world. It is normal for them not to have heard of it. The little village girl's character was indeed different from others, so she asked the question, who wrote it? Tang Yin and Tang Bohu, a talented man from Wuxian County, Suzhou. You lied, there is no such person in Suzhou. Su Buling naturally knew that there was no such person, and even if there was, it would take hundreds of years for him to be born. It seems that this girl has not been ignorant of world affairs since she was a child, and is quite familiar with the outside world. He could only continue to explain. It has just become famous, so it's normal for girls not to have heard of it. Who is Tang Yin's father? Who did he study under? This question obviously confused Su Buling. In this world, it is very important to respect teachers. As long as you are a scholar, you will inevitably say teacher so and so when introducing yourself to show respect for your teacher. Famous talents are more so true. For others, just like in Jianghu, they think a hero is very powerful, and the first thing they ask is, who taught such a powerful apprentice? Since he has memorized other people's poems, how could he not even know these things? Su Buling hesitated for a moment and said with a smile, Tang Yin was born in a poor family and was self-taught. I have never heard about his family. The little village girl frowned slightly, obviously not believing it. She shook her head and said, you, like everyone else, like to lie. That's all, just memorize poetry. Su Buling looked a little helpless and continued, the Peach Blossom Fairy planted peach trees and picked peach blossoms in exchange for wine money. The stars are like the sea, and the night fire is quiet. Su Buling was whittling a wooden bowl and reciting peach blossom poems in a calm voice. After listening to a few words, the little village girl propped her chin up with her hands and placed her elbows on the armrests of the recliner, looking at her seriously. After reading a poem, Su Buling smiled a little. How? Very good. Why did you read this poem to me? It's so emotional. Su Buring smiled, turned his head to look at the hundreds of saplings outside the fence, and asked. What's the girl doing planting so many peach trees? The little village girl thought for a while and said seriously, pick peach blossoms in exchange for wine money. Su Buling looked at the deserted mountains and fields dozens of miles around. How can you change if you don't go out? It will bloom in February or March next year. Just pick it and change it. It's not like I don't have legs. Su Buling was speechless. He felt that he and this little village girl were not on the same channel, so he had to change his question. What did the girl do planting peach trees before? The little village girl's answer was still straightforward, the peach blossoms are beautiful. All right. Su Buletinling nodded. The fish is gradually grilled and the aroma is fragrant. Su Buling baked it first, so naturally it was ready first. He immediately pulled out the wooden stick stuck in the ground and handed it to the little village girl. You eat first, and I'll peel the bowl first. The little village girl took a look, took out a handkerchief from her arms, wrapped it in a wooden stick and took it. Then she turned the lounge chair around, with her back to Su Buling, and started eating grilled fish with her head down. The little black dog also lay down in front of her. Su Buling was whittling the wooden bowl. Maybe it was because the surroundings were too quiet, and he said again. There are many beautiful flowers in the world. This sea of peach blossoms is only beautiful in early spring, and not so much at other times. I know a place where hundreds of kinds of flowers are planted. Most of the flowers in the world are found everywhere, and the scenery is different throughout the year. Now that I have passed by, I should be able to see endless wintersweets, camellias, and clivias. The little village girl poked her eyes out from behind the chair and asked dubiously, is there such a place? Su Buling smiled and said, I definitely didn't lie to the girl this time. I was born there and lived there until I was 7 or 8 years old. The little village girl thought for a moment and shook her head slightly, the prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 564. The bright moonlight shines in the canyon. Lying next to the firewood pile behind the earthen stove, you can see the vast sea of stars above the mountain top from the door, which is so beautiful. Su Buletinling was covered with thatch and sleeping soundly, while the black dog was lying in the kennel at the door, making a gurgling sound. The night was very quiet, and I don't know how long it had passed. There was another rustling sound in the side room opposite the courtyard dam. Wearing a skirt. Su Buling raised his head and opened his eyes, only to see the door open and the little village girl come out of the house, her dress neat and covered with a blanket. He thought it would be convenient to wake up at night, so he closed his eyes and continued to sleep. But after the little village girl left the room, she ran straight to the kitchen door, took a small wooden stick, squatted down next to the earthen stove, and poked Su Buling's leg with the small wooden stick. Hello? Hello? Su Buletinling looked sleepy, opened his eyes, and tightened his tight robe. Girl, what do you want to do? The little village girl squatted at the entrance of the earthen stove, you frowned slightly, and her eyes were a little confused. In the poem you just read, what does the tomb of the heroes of Wuling is missing mean? That's it? I thought it would be a long night without any intention of sleeping peacefully. Su Buling was bored, blinked his eyes, sat up, and explained seriously, well, the missing tomb of the heroes of Wuling means, is. At this point, his expression froze slightly. 5 tombs refers to the tombs of Han Jiaozu, Han Hui, Han Jing, Han Wu, and Han Zhao. How can this be explained? The little village girl obviously has obsessive-compulsive disorder. She was tortured by this unintelligible poem for half the night. She would not be able to sleep until she understood it. At this time, he squatted on the ground and moved 2 steps forward. What do you mean? Su Buling held it in for a long time. Well, it's a character in a book. It's a novel. The people in it are all fictitious. Wuling refers to the tombs of the 5 emperors in the novel. When the little village girl heard this, she naturally asked, which book? The Han Dynasty. Han Dynasty. The little village girl thought about it carefully and said slightly displeased, you are lying, you don't have this book. As the saying goes, a lie needs 100 lies to make up for it. Su Buling knew that if he asked any more questions, it would definitely exceed his knowledge accumulation, so he could only say with a smile. I just wrote it, and I haven't read it. It's just a history book, so it's not interesting. The little village girl nodded thoughtfully, thought for a while, and then asked. Has Mr. Tang written any other poems? Read them to me. As he spoke, he stood up, ran to the cupboard, picked up the only remaining pot of home-brewed peach blossom wine, brought 2 wooden bowls over, placed them in front of Su Buling, and poured 2 bowls. I'll buy you a drink. He. After being treated like this, Su Buling didn't feel sleepy anymore. He sat on the floor against the wall, gave her the small stool, and then picked up the wine bowl. I know a lot of poetry, but it's just leisurely and elegant, and I don't know much about the person who wrote the poetry. If you don't want to get to the bottom of it, I can read it to you. The little village girl sat down on the bench, holding a small wooden bowl, and nodded. Speak boldly, I won't ask you. Su Buling picked up the wine bowl and took a sip of the not-so-drinking bitter wine, and thought for a while. I still remember one of Tang Bohu's poems, Lu Hua, the spring is beautiful and the autumn is ruthless, and the beauty fades without stopping. Huangliang Meng Spring Festival Gala, why bother to meet again after separation? Youth is short and fleeting, we should have fun in time and cherish our youth. The little village girl also took a sip of her wine. After listening carefully, she nodded slightly. It's not as good as the previous one. Are there any others? Others? Su Buling searched his mind and continued, there is also a plum blossom cut by Li Qingzhao. The fragrance of red lotus roots lingers in the jade mushrooms. In the autumn, he undresses his clothes lightly and gets on the orchid boat alone. Who in the clouds sent a brocade book? When Yanzu returns, the moon is full in the west building. The flowers are floating and the water is flowing, a kind of lovesickness, and there is no way to eliminate this feeling, so I frown, but it is written in my heart when my husband is not around. The little village girl thought about it carefully. It's not bad, but it's too sad for spring and autumn. I don't like it. Is there anything that sounds more comfortable? One that makes people happy? Su Buling smiled a little. It seemed that this little village girl was living in seclusion here because she was not hurt by emotions. She was quite optimistic. He pondered for a moment and said softly. Sitting alone in the secluded bamboo, playing the piano and whistling loudly. People in the deep forest don't know, but the bright moon comes to shine. How about it? This is good. Are there any more? The little village girl obviously didn't drink well, her face was a bit red, but she was very energetic. She looked straight at Su Buling, without any other emotions mixed in, with pure satisfaction. A lonely man and a woman in the deep mountains and old forests, the charming atmosphere should have been there. But for some reason, when Su Buling sat in front of this little woman, it was difficult for her to have other thoughts even if she was beautiful. It feels like a piece of pure white jade is placed in front of you, which makes you feel ashamed and gives up those messy thoughts from the bottom of your heart. It's like ordinary people meeting a saint and worrying that their Philistine words and deeds will make the saint look down on them. Su Buling can be regarded as one of the best among people. This is the first time he feels this way, but it is not a bad thing. He chuckled lightly. Of course there is. I am very good at Taoism in my middle age, and I live in the southern border of the mountains in my later years. I go alone every time when I am happy, and I know all my successes. When I walk to a waterless place, I sit and watch the clouds rise. I accidentally visit Lin Su and talk and laugh without returning. Period. It talks about the secluded life in Zongnan Mountain, which is somewhat similar to the girl now. The little village girl savored it carefully and smiled. I met an old man in the forest by chance, and we talked and laughed without a return date. You are the old man I met in the woods. We can chat all the time without thinking about when to go back. This smile was as bright as peach blossoms. It was the first time that Su Buling saw the little village girl smile. He was slightly stunned, and then he smiled. What old man? I guess he is not even as old as you, girl. That's what the poem says. Well, I met a young man by chance, and we talked and laughed without a return date. It doesn't rhyme. Then change it, let me think. The long night was silent, and the 4 fields were silent. The jade plate was suspended in the air, casting bright moonlight, which was scattered in the farmyard among thousands of peach trees. 2 men and women who had never met each other sat behind the earthen stove in the small kitchen, like poor farmers in a mountain village, but they talked about the most famous literary treasures of all dynasties. The scene was both weird and special. The weather was too cold, and Su Buling lit the stove in the middle of the night. Maybe she was hungry. The little village girl stood up, took a frozen fish from the window, and stewed a pot of fish soup with pickled vegetables as the auxiliary material. Her expression was still focused, listening to Su Buling, who was lighting the fire, explaining poetry. Su Buling watched the little village girl wandering around in the kitchen. For some reason, he felt that this life seemed quite comfortable. After nearly 2 months of running around and fighting, it suddenly stopped, just like a knight who had been licking blood on the edge of a knife for half a lifetime. In the interval between fighting and killing, he suddenly came to this secluded place. When the storm stopped, he felt that the trivial matters of the past were meaningless, and he didn't want to pick them up again after putting them down. Perhaps only the Jianghu who have experienced the ups and downs of life and death can understand this kind of plain good. Unfortunately, Su Buling was not born in the Jianghu. There was no such thing as returning to the mountains and retiring in the imperial family. The two chatted about poetry in the kitchen, sipping a jar of wine, and finally drank it all. Unknowingly, the east was getting white, and it was already early morning. The little village girl was sleepy, still holding her chin with her hands, still listening carefully, and had no intention of going to sleep. She said that she would not ask questions, but when she encountered words and sentences she did not understand, she would still ask about them. Even if Su Buling did not know, she had to make up a reasonable explanation for her, otherwise she would keep asking. Su Buling was dry-mouthed, and seeing that it was already dawn, he said, "It's dawn, girl, go to bed early, staying up late is harmful to your health." The little village girl had a bit of unsatisfied eyes, but she still nodded and rubbed her eyes. "I thought you wrote it at first, but so many poems, one person can't write it." "You are quite honest." After saying that, she got up and went back to the side room. Su Buling shook his head and chuckled. He was not sleepy at dawn, and he had to hurry to go out and meet Chu Chu, so he walked out of the kitchen with a sword and went to the river to continue fishing. The Prince is Very Fierce. Author, Guan Zi. Chapter 565. The morning light first appeared, and the sun filled the empty and lonely canyon. In the small courtyard within the fence, the little village girl slept not long before she opened the door and washed alone. Then, as usual, she carried a hoe and led the little black dog to the outermost side of hundreds of saplings and began to dig holes. Cha! Cha! The hoe was waved gently, and the little village girl was still recalling the pile of poems she had never seen before that she heard last night. After just digging a few times, she felt something was wrong in the corner of her eyes, which disturbed her thoughts and made her unable to concentrate. Turning his head to look, he saw that the snowman used to cover the straight knife yesterday had a few more pebbles on his face, with eyes, nose, and smiling lips, and a scarf made of hay. The little village girl frowned slightly and looked at it carefully. She felt that the snowman matched well and didn't look awkward, so she looked outside again. "Yesterday I asked Su Buling to insert the knife farther away. It seems that Su Buling obeyed." He pulled out the knife from the snowman's back and inserted it on the outside of the sapling, right in the middle of the road, just like hundreds of neatly arranged saplings. One of the trees grew outside, even more unexpected than yesterday. "This guy." The little village girl's eyes were a little annoyed. It didn't matter if her back was turned at first, but now that she saw it, she couldn't bear it anymore. She leaned her hoe against the peach tree, trotted forward again, and started building a snowman. After working for more than half an hour, The big snowman was finally piled up, and he did not forget to decorate it with the same nose and eyes according to the shape of the old snowman. But after the work was done, the little village girl ran back to the hoe and took a few glances, and then she felt something was wrong. The two sides of the peach forest were symmetrical, with a snowman on the left and a snowman in front. There was nothing on the right side, which made it feel a bit empty. Is it possible to pile up another one? The little village girl thought about it and decided that if she built a snowman again, she would have no time to work today, so she might as well do something else. Thinking of this, she put the hoe back in the yard, then picked up the change of clothes, put them in the wooden basin, and walked to the river with the puppy. Following Su Buletinling's footprints, we walked through the snowy forest path, came to the river and looked downstream. After walking for half a mile, we found Su Buletinling bending down to fish near a large pool. Make. Su Buling concentrated on searching for the fish hidden under the stone. When he heard the sound by the river, he turned around and looked slightly surprised. "Girl, why are you here?" The little village girl placed the wooden basin by the river, found a stone to sit on, and whispered. "You are not allowed to stick your knife outside tomorrow. Keep it with you, otherwise I will look awkward. I built a snowman to block it. Didn't you notice?" Su Buling was slightly stunned. He really didn't expect that the exquisite snowman was just to block the eyesore. But considering that this girl has both obsessive-compulsive disorder and mysophobia, it makes sense that she would do such a thing. Su Buring smiled softly and raised his hand to point to the 7 or 8 fish that had been slapped to death by the river. "I'll catch enough fish today, so I don't have to disturb the girl tomorrow." The little village girl stopped washing clothes and thought for a moment. "That's right, you haven't finished the poem last night. What should I do?" "I don't know much, so I'll just tell you now. Where did you talk about it this morning?" "Sushi's Zhejiang Moon." "Good." Su Buring stood in the river, groping for the fish under the stone with his sword, and carefully memorized the poems and songs he knew. The little village girl was sitting by the river washing clothes. Her hands were red from the cold, but she didn't care much and still asked for the truth. There were only a few fish under one pool, and they were all fished out quickly, and the distance became farther and farther away. The little village girl didn't have many clothes. After washing them, she ran back with the wooden basin in her arms. Not long after, he changed into a skirt and ran over again. The underskirt is obviously not worn much, and it is still brand new. The whole person looks younger, just like a young lady waiting for marriage. The original dark blue dress was put into the basin and continued to be washed. Su Buling had good eyesight and could tell that the fabric of this underskirt was valuable. He was a little curious about the identity of the little village girl and asked again. "Girl, what's your name?" The little village girl was sitting by the river washing clothes. She shook her head and said, "I won't ask you, and you don't ask me either. If you talk about other things, I won't listen." Su Buling sighed, stopped prying into other people's privacy, and continued to talk about poetry. It doesn't take long to wash a few pieces of clothes, no matter how careful they are. At noon, the little village girl went back with the wooden basin in her arms and never came back. Su Buling knew that Choo Choo and Nightingale were waiting outside, so he couldn't stay here for too long and seize the time to catch fish. "I worked from morning to evening until I touched down the entire river in the canyon, chopped down a few trees in the wild forest and chopped them into firewood, and then I returned to the peach blossom forest with a good harvest." Different from yesterday, the little village girl did not sit in the house and weave, but stood inside the fence and looked up. When he saw Su Buling coming back, he turned around and ran into the main room, took out the table with great difficulty, and brought out 2 stools. Falling under the afterglow, dozens of steps away, you can smell the aroma of food wafting from the kitchen. Su Buring was slightly surprised. He pulled out the straight knife stuck next to the snowman, walked to the fence and took a look, but saw that the only 4 fish left by the kitchen window were gone. The little village girl stood in front of the stove and took off the lid of the pot. The steaming mist covered her upper body, and there was a large pot of fish soup inside. Su Buling put a bundle of firewood behind the earthen stove and looked at it. "Why did you stew all 4 fishes?" The little village girl stood opposite the earthen stove filled with mist. The mist obscured her expression. Her voice was as light as ever. "You can't work without eating. If there are not enough fish, just go catch some more tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Su Buling shook his head and picked up a bunch of fish. "Not really. I caught 25 today, enough for you to eat for more than 10 days. It's okay to have a little more today." After saying this, the little village girl was silent for a while. After a while, she said "oh" softly, scooped up the fish soup into a small bowl, and brought it to the table. Su Buling was really hungry after a busy day. Since there was enough food, he didn't hesitate and sat opposite the little village girl to eat heartily. The two sat opposite each other in the farmyard. The black dog was lying under the table picking up fish bones. When eating, the little village girl didn't say anything. Su Buling felt strange in his heart, but he didn't know how to describe the current environment. During the meal, he tilted his head to look at the peach forest outside and asked with a smile, "How many peach trees are you going to plant?" The little village girl chewed slowly, as if she was worried. Her answer was not as clear as yesterday. She thought for a while before speaking. "Plant it all, plant all the vacant land. What will happen after it's full? Change to another place and continue planting. There are hundreds of miles around here, and you can't finish planting in your lifetime." "Oh." Su Buling shook his head and smiled. The little village girl saw his smile and raised her eyes. "Do you think I'm stupid?" Su Buling's smile froze, and he shook his head quickly. "No, well, afforestation is a good thing. It's normal for ordinary people to think it's meaningless because they can't understand it." The little village girl was satisfied and whispered, "People outside are not as good as trees. You won't understand even if I tell you, so I won't tell you." Su Buling nodded and said nothing more. A big pot of fish soup was eaten by Su Buling until there was no drop left. The work was done, so it was time to leave. The red sun hung on the top of the mountain, and the setting sun sprinkled on hundreds of neatly arranged saplings, casting long shadows in the snow. Su Buling hung his sword and straight knife on his waist, stood inside the fence, looked at the mountain in the distance, and hesitated. The little village girl washed the pots and bowls carefully, put them neatly in the cupboard, walked out of the small door of the kitchen, saw Su Buling's back, paused, and said softly, "It's getting dark, and it's dozens of miles away. It's not easy to walk at night." Su Buling held the hilt of the sword, stood at the edge of the fence, and turned around. "There are still people waiting outside, we can't delay too long, I really disturbed the girl." The little village girl stood at the door, with a little disappointment on her gentle face, without any cover, or she didn't know how to cover it at all. She nodded gently. "Then go slowly. Don't come back after you go out, and don't tell outsiders." "Of course." Su Buling smiled, stepped out of the fence, and walked out towards the sunset. When he passed the big snowman piled in the snow, he looked back. The little village girl was still standing at the kitchen door, and the black dog squatted obediently beside the hem of her skirt, as if still in the dim sunset. Seeing him turn his head, the little village girl raised her hand and waved, as if saying goodbye. Su Buling stood there, tapping the hilt of the sword with his fingers. After pondering for a long time, he still said, "Girl, I really know a sea of flowers, which is more beautiful than here, and there are no outsiders to disturb you. Do you want to live somewhere else? If you want, I can take you out." The little village girl frowned slightly, looked at the peach blossom forest that had been planted for many years, and shook her head. "I won't go out after that," She went back to the side room with her skirt lifted, closed the door, and inserted the bolt. After a long silence, Su Buling turned and walked out of the peach forest, looking back from time to time. There was no movement in the farmyard and 3 small houses until the view was blocked by the trees. Su Buling sighed softly, feeling empty in his heart, but he could do nothing about it. When you are in the rivers and lakes, you may not be able to do what you want. Many times you have no choice, just to survive. When you are in the rivers and lakes, you may be free and unrestrained, wandering around the world and taking things as they come, walking when you want to walk and stopping when you want to stop. But some people are not born into the rivers and lakes, and are destined to have nothing to do with either. Su Buling is good at everything, but the only mistake is that he was born in an emperor's family. Being a knight all his life is just a dream, and the whole world is actually in front of him, so he can walk when he wants to walk, but he can't stop when he wants to stop. Emperors, dukes, generals, noble families, and millions of soldiers in the world all have 1,000 connections with him. Since he was born, it is impossible for him to jump out of this big frame, and he doesn't even have time to stay here for a few more days. Falling into the afterglow, Su Buling walked slowly with his sword, getting closer and closer to the edge of the canyon, farther and farther away from the small peach forest, and the surroundings returned to being deserted. More than 20 fish, are they enough to eat? Such a girl, living alone in the deep mountains and old forests, what should she do if she gets sick? Maybe she has a psychological disorder, autism. If she is sick, she must be treated, she can't just leave it here and ignore it. The more he thought about it, the more confused he became. Su Buling's brows gradually frowned, and he walked to the edge of the canyon, facing the steep stone wall, and stopped. After hesitating for a long time, Su Buling turned around and walked back to the depths of the peach forest. Everything he did was worthy of his conscience, and everyone he met was worthy of his feelings. I happened to meet such a lonely girl. I can't just leave like this. She may have a mental illness, but I don't. I took her out to let Jeju see her. It's always for her good. With this idea in mind, Su Buling quickly passed through the peach forest and approached the small farmhouse full of peach branches. But halfway through, Su Buling's ears moved slightly, and suddenly he heard someone walking in the forest. Su Buling heard that it was not the footsteps of the little village girl. He was alert and sneaked silently to the source of the sound with the handle of the knife. Through the dense weeds and trees, a man in martial arts uniform was seen walking slowly in the peach forest. He had a sword hanging from his waist and a basket on his back. He looked like a guard of a certain family. The basket was filled with daily utensils such as needles and thread, grain, and oil. Su Buling frowned slightly and followed the guard silently to the edge of the peach forest full of saplings. The guard poked his head out and took a closer look. In the farmhouse, the door of the main house was open. The little village girl was sitting at the loom, weaving seriously. The little black dog seemed to notice the guard coming over and tugged at the little village girl's skirt. The little village girl hurriedly stopped and ran to the door. But after seeing the guard, the little village girl looked a little unhappy and turned around to continue fiddling with the loom. After the guard saw the people, he gently put down the basket and quietly retreated from the peach forest. Su Buling saw the scene and guessed that it might be the little village girl's family who knew about the fighting outside and sent someone to see if the little village girl was affected. Since there were family members paying attention, and judging from the situation, they were of high status and took it seriously, Su Buling naturally didn't want to meddle in other people's business. Su Buling stood in the depths of the dense forest, watching the little village girl weaving in the house. After the guards walked away, the little village girl stood up and walked out, picked up the basket on the ground, and when she passed the new snowman outside the peach forest, she bumped it with her shoulder and knocked the snowman's head off. Su Buling spread his hands slightly, with a bit of helplessness in his eyes. After watching the little village girl disappear into the house, he turned and walked to the outside of the peach forest, never looking back. The setting sun sank into the mountains, and the full moon hung on the branches again. Inside the fence wall, the table and 2 stools were still placed in the yard, without any sound, dead silent, as if it would not change for hundreds of years. In the bedroom of the side house, the little village girl put the basket on the desk, took out the paper from it, and copied all the poems she heard today on it with a pen, then lay on the spotless embroidered bed, staring at the top of the curtain in a daze. I stayed up late last night and slept for a while during the day, which disrupted my unchanging work and rest schedule for several years. I should have gone to bed, but I couldn't sleep at this time. The little village girl lay for a long time, then suddenly sat up, opened the door, and looked at the pile of firewood neatly stacked behind the stove in the small kitchen opposite. The stranger had disappeared long ago. The little village girl stood at the door and thought for a moment, then turned around and took out the oil lamp and placed it on the table in the courtyard. Then she ran to the peach forest outside, brought back handfuls of snow, piled them on the stool beside the table, worked hard for half the night, and made a snowman on the stool. After that, the little village girl placed the unwanted wooden bowls and chopsticks in front of the snowman, then ran back to the house, took out the woven cloth, and cut it by the light. As for why she did all this, she never thought about it, nor did she care, because she did it when she wanted to. Just like the peach tree outside, the flowers bloom when they should bloom, and the flowers fall when they should fall, without so many twists and turns, and the twists and turns of people's hearts. On a winter night, a light was as small as a bean, and the sky gradually fell again. The woman was carefully sewing in front of the bed. In the canyon where time seems to not pass, the snowman sits quietly at the table. Although he can't recite poetry or catch fish, at least the snowman has no worldly concerns and won't run away. As long as you want him to stay here, he can stay here forever. Volume 7, The Dragon Breaks the Sea, End. Volume 8, The City of War, please look forward to it. Thank you for the 24,000 reward. Thank you Tingmiankak for the 10,000 reward. It may be more complicated to write the detailed outline later, so the update may be slower today and tomorrow. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Prince is Very Fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 566. Su Buling climbed up from the stone wall beside the canyon, came to the side of the waterfall, and looked back at the dark valley. He couldn't see the firelight deep in the dense forest, but he could know the approximate location of the little village girl. Su Buling stopped and looked at it for a moment, then gathered his thoughts and walked quickly outward along the river. The white snowflakes fell again, and the mountains and fields covered with peach trees were silent. Occasionally, arrows falling into the water could be seen. Speaking of which, it was only 2 days, not that long, but living in the canyon isolated from the world for 2 days made Su Buling have a slight change in his mentality. Well, intrigues and fighting were quite boring. But boredom is boring, things will not stop with the change of mentality. Now that we have come out of the canyon, we have to continue walking. Su Buletinling walked quickly through the forest with his sword, and followed his memory to find the big peach tree where Chendeazai was ambushed. Traces of the fighting can still be seen near the big peach tree, but they have all been dealt with. The footprints and sword marks were destroyed, and Zhang Buhan's body was burned, leaving only a charred corpse. There were several rows of footprints near the fire, as well as the tracks of hounds. It was obvious that the wolf guard saw the fire and ran over to investigate. Su Buling searched around for a while, but couldn't find the code, so he came to the place where the horses were hidden under the mountain. He found the mark left by the nightingale, and then followed the mark to the depths of the mountain in Pinggu Peach Blossom Sea, and finally found a place where the horses were hidden. Traces of Choo Choo and others were found in the natural stone cave under the stone wall. The night was dark, and falcons were often flying over high in the sky, searching for figures hiding in the mountains. In the past few days, Su Buling has actually discovered falcons in the canyon. However, the falcons of the Detective Investigation Department will identify targets. The daily routine of farmers in the mountains will not attract the attention of falcons. Only people who move sneakily in the mountains and fields will attract the attention of falcons. Only the eagle will run back and guide the wolf guards to search. Otherwise, if they see people in an area of several hundred miles, they will go back and report them. No matter how many wolf guards there are, they will run away and die. There are barren mountains and wild ridges here, and there are no houses around. Choo Choo and others are obviously targets of suspicious behavior. In order to prevent being discovered by the falcon, there is no fire in the cave. In the cave, Lu Beiming was holding a tree branch and demonstrating sword skills in the cave. Nightingale looked like he was studying very seriously, obviously cherishing the opportunity to be taught by a master-level boss in person. Zhongli Chuchu had wanted to learn martial arts since he was a child, but at this time, he obviously couldn't afford that thought. A man was sitting alone under the big tree outside the cave, leaning against the trunk, looking at the mountains outside in a daze. The green eyes looked crystal clear under the dim light, like two cat eyes. Their beauty remained intact, but they looked a bit haggard, obviously due to worry. Su Buletinling silently walked up to the back, lowered his head and took a look. Looking down from a high position, Choo Choo's bulging clothes were so spectacular that he unconsciously thought of two peanuts. Choo Choo likes to wear red skirts as much as the baby does, and she is a bit greedy for the baby. Su Buling blinked and said to himself, "Don't look at anything inappropriate," then raised his hand and patted Zhongli Chuchu's shoulder. Zhongli Chuchu trembled in fright, turned around hurriedly, and touched the poisonous needle on her waist. Seeing that it was Su Buling, Zhongli's eyes clearly showed a bit of surprise. As soon as the smile touched his cheeks, it froze again, and then turned lukewarm. He turned back and continued to look ahead, and said lightly, "Why did you come back?" There was a little hiccup and it was delayed for 2 days. Yeah. Choo Choo glanced back again, and after seeing that there were no traces of injury on Su Buletinling's body, she averted her eyes and stopped talking. Su Buling saw that Choo Choo seemed to be in a bad mood, so he turned around and walked into the cave without any polite greetings. When Lu Beiming heard the sound, he put down the branch and walked out of the cave. He didn't ask any more questions and just said, "All the wolf guards from the Detective Division's Tianzi Battalion have arrived in Yuzhou and are rushing to Pengwu. If you are 2 days late, you won't be able to get out." Su Buling smiled peacefully, "Thank you uncle for coming to help. I was delayed. Let's go now." Lu Beiming held his hand on the hilt of the sword at his waist and thought for a moment, "I can only send you out of Yuzhou, and you have to walk the rest of the way by yourself. However, there may be trouble in Jiangnan. After these few days, the court should be able to. I am too busy to pursue you with all my strength." When Su Buling heard this, he turned his head. "The king of Wu is preparing to revolt. Where did he get the soldiers?" Lu Beiming shook his head, "I don't know much. You can check it yourself after you get out." Seeing this, Su Buling had no choice but to give up. After taking out the horses from the cave, Lu Beiming got on his horse and said, "I'll go to the front to check the situation, and you guys will follow." Then he rode towards the outskirts of Pengwu. Nightingale sat on the horse and turned to look at the big tree. Seeing Zhongli Chuchu still sitting in a daze, she said, "Sister Chuchu, let's go." Zhongli came back to his senses, looked back, stood up on his knees, patted his bright red dress, and came between the two horses, wanting to sit with Nightingale. It's just that he is still evading pursuit, and Nightingale's horse is a little worse. It is obvious that he cannot pay attention to the defense between men and women at this time. Su Buling hung the sword on the side of the horse and stretched out his hand. Chu, sit with me. It will be easier to run when we meet the wolf guard later. Zhongli Chuchu's expression froze slightly, and he glanced at Su Buling, slightly hesitant, apparently recalling the last time they were face to face. Before she could think clearly, Su Buling grabbed her belt and tried to lift her up. Zhongli Chuchu's eyes panicked, and he quickly blocked Su Buling's hand. He pursed his lips and thought for a while, then he got on his horse obediently and sat behind Su Buling, keeping a slight distance from each other. Drive dash. Su Buling gently pinched the horse's belly and walked toward the outskirts of Pengwu. 3 people and 2 horses were walking among the mountains. There was no sound in the surrounding fields, except for the hazy flying snow around them. Zhongli Chuchu was sitting behind him, looking at the back of Su Buling's head with mixed feelings in his eyes. After experiencing so many things in just a few days, Zhongli Chuchu's mind was in a mess and he didn't know where to think of it. The chaos of being chased made her temporarily forget what happened in the inn, but when she settled down, the scenes she saw that day reappeared in her mind uncontrollably. The master was meticulous and got into the curtain, 2 big white balls. Su Buletinling hurriedly put on his clothes. The master was huddled behind the quilt, his body was covered with traces of being abused, that look of fear and embarrassment. The fragrance on Su Buletinling's body. That's her master. She has always regarded her as her dear master. I really wanted to be angry with Su Buletinling, but I couldn't get angry for some reason. I only felt unreasonable grievances and some subtle jealousy and indignation. It was obviously her who met Su Buling first. How could master do such a thing? Zhongli Chuchu sat behind Su Buling and was silent for a long time. Looking at Su Buling's back, he weakly said. No, what should I call you in the future? The master's man is an elder. She has been thinking about it for a long time in the past 2 days and thinks that he should be called master. But this title is so weird that she can't even think about it, let alone say it. Su Buling held the reins, his expression slightly embarrassed, and he turned his head. Haha, well, Chu, you should call me Mr. Su. Zhongli Chuchu was sitting behind him, with some invisible grievance hidden in his eyes. You and my master are sleeping in the same bed, how can I be your equal? Su Buling heard the dissatisfaction in the words and said with a smile, Chu, your master and I are really in love with each other. Well, when I met her near Wudang, I liked her quite a lot, and later on I fell in love with her. It will all work out. Zhongli Chuchu clasped his hands and tried to keep his tone calm as usual. What about me? Su Buling blinked. Well, Miss Chuchu and I seem to be quite destined. What's the fate? Zhongli Chuchu's eyes were red, and his voice was a little harder. In Suzhou, I took the initiative to find you. In Jiangnan, I took the initiative to find you. It's the same with Hongshan Lake. It's the same with Yuzhu. It's always been me who takes the initiative to find you. Do you think I want to cause trouble for you? I just want to meet you. It's just you. I want you to look at me more like you did to King Yi and Manzi. You are so smart and know everything about women's thoughts, can't you tell? The voice reached this point, with a cry and vibrato, which was extremely depressing. Can't you see that I like you? Since you are not interested in me, why do you have to help me so hypocritically to make you like me more and more? After the words fell, the night became quiet, and the wind and snow almost stagnated. Nightingale was riding a horse and was eavesdropping quietly. When she heard this, she silently rode ahead and pretended not to know anything. Su Buling's expression was slightly stiff, and he held the reins and walked slowly. He could feel the slightly rapid breathing behind him, and his eyes were staring at the back of his head. Say it. Can't you see it? Zhongli Chuchu had been holding back her emotions for several days, and finally couldn't bear it anymore. She might not have realized it before, but now that the words came out of her mouth, she suddenly understood why her heart had been so desperate and distressed these days. Because this unparalleled man in front of her deliberately aroused her interest in men and showed her the best aspects of men in the world, causing her to sink unknowingly. After that, she married her master, which was almost cruel. All her thoughts left her with no room for maneuver. "You're a liar, bastard. Why didn't you ignore me from the beginning? Why did you pretend to ignore me, but then help me wholeheartedly? Why didn't you tell me earlier that you like my master? You're just a bastard." Zhongli's green eyes were filled with tears. He raised his hand and slapped Su Buring on the back several times, hysterical. Su Buling looked embarrassed, stopped his horse, and turned around. Choo-choo, choo-choo, don't get excited. Well, I am the prince of the feudal lord, so it doesn't matter if I marry 2 more concubines. Bah, you are shameless. When Zhongli Chuchu heard this, his foreign face was full of shame, anger, and irritation. He raised his hand and slapped Su Buring on the back a few times. "Go ahead and dream. It's not like I can't live without you. Do you think a woman wants to fall in love with you? I won't be like Ning King Yi, you married my master, I just forgot about you. After I get out, I will go back to South Vietnam and never see you again in this life." Her words were a bit incoherent, and no matter how mature her body was, she was still a teenage girl mentally. It was very difficult to restrain herself when encountering this kind of thing. Su Buletinling's face turned a little red, and he comforted her with a pleasant look and a soft voice. "Choo-choo, don't be so excited, I'm just talking casually. Well, I'm running for my life now, don't attract the wolf guard." When Zhongli Chuchu heard this, he regained consciousness a little, sobbed twice and became a little quieter. He stared at the back of Su Buling's head, silent, his breathing rising and falling. Su Buling walked slowly for a while, then turned back and said, "Choo-choo. Don't call me Choo-choo, call me Miss Zhongli, we will just be ordinary friends from now on." Zhongli Chuchu has been lonely since childhood, and lacks emotions. Even if her mind has stabilized a little and she said the toughest words, she couldn't hide her red eyes and trembling shoulders. Su Buling wanted to look back, but Zhongli Chuchu raised her hand and pushed his cheek back. "If you are aggressive again, I will jump down and leave by myself." "I didn't say anything, how can I be aggressive?" Su Buling sighed helplessly, and could only stay still and let the angry Chuchu calm down by herself. Zhongli Chuchu took a few deep breaths and suppressed the turbulent waves in her heart. It might be a hysterical venting. She said everything she wanted to say in her heart, and her mood was much better than the previous few days. She clenched her palms tightly, thought for a moment, and then said, "Don't tell anyone about what happened tonight. From now on, I will no longer like you. I will only treat you as a friend and will not hinder you and my master. But I will keep an eye on you. If you dare to bully my master, I will fight you to the death even if I have to sacrifice my life." These were still angry words. Su Buling nodded lightly, without comforting or promising anything. Zhongli Chuchu talked for a long time, venting her anger and grievances. After thinking for a while, she took off the ice flower lotus pendant from her waist and held it in her palm. She wanted to return it to Su Buling, but after hesitating for a long time, she hung it back on her waist and hummed. "I told you how to solve the dragon lock poison. You have to return the jade pendant to me. We don't owe each other anything, so I don't need to return it to you. Of course. And my camel was lost because of you. You have to find it back for me. It's a small matter." As they chatted, the two of them and the horse walked away in the forest in a strange way. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 567. The rice clouds are not yellow without rain, and the empty buckwheat flowers are frosted early. I have endured hunger to spend the rest of the year, and it is even longer than the leap year. The cold winter of the 12th month of the 11th year of Zhaohong seemed much longer than in previous years. This was true for Su Buling, who was running around, and for the people of Jiangnan Road, it was so long that it was a luxury to spend a day. The New Year's Eve that used to symbolize family reunion also showed its original meaning at this time. People who owed rent and debts had to pay off their debts on the last day of the year. The New Year was like passing a customs check, so it was called the New Year's Eve. It is true that Jiangnan is the richest in the world, but the rich can never be the people who face the lowest and back the sky. A flood in autumn left no harvest in Muzhu, Xiaozhu and other places, and the people's houses and farmland were washed away. Hundreds of thousands of people suffered and became refugees with no money in their pockets and 1,000 thunders in their stomachs. Originally, the court should have vigorously provided disaster relief and exempted taxes at this time, but last year, there was a severe drought in Shu, and the court had exempted Shu's annual tax for 1 year. Tax revenue was hit hard. If the annual tax in Jiangnan was exempted, how could it support nearly 1 million troops on the long front? The court did not care and let the king of Wu find a way out. The king of Wu paid out of his own pocket and lobbied the wealthy families to make up for the tax deficit for the court, but how to feed hundreds of thousands of mouths? Perhaps the king of Wu could help hundreds of thousands of people survive this winter by draining his family's assets and forcing the wealthy families to open their warehouses, but why did the king of Wu risk his own vitality to take the blame for the court, which was not his fault? Song Siming? Just because his surname is Song, he has to open his heart to your cousin who is the emperor? Obviously impossible. The world is not his king of Wu. Song Ji summoned the 7th prince to the capital and took action against Su Buling with the intention of reducing the vassal state, which made the king of Wu feel the knife hanging on his neck. It is impossible to stop at just one vassal. As long as this knife is raised, Song Ji will definitely find ways to reduce the power of the 7 vassal kings to a controllable level during his reign. Song Ji's plan against Prince Su ended in failure, and he may stop temporarily, but many vassal kings have seen Song Ji's ambition. How can they let Song Ji stabilize the situation and find an opportunity to attack again? The court repaired the pass, raised the iron cavalry, and accumulated heavy troops, sucking the blood of the people in Jiangnan and Shu. The court's taxes increased year by year, and the families with fields at home gradually became unable to bear it. They had long been complaining. Now a disaster has exposed all the accumulated drawbacks in previous years and broke out in just a few months. As the extremely cold weather that has not been seen in many years ravaged Jiangnan, the refugees spread across thousands of miles were homeless and hungry. When the despair in the hearts of the refugees reached the extreme, only a small flame was needed to burn the entire Jiangnan. The right time and right place were all there, only one person was missing. After the king of Wu got the jade seal, the person who started the fire naturally appeared. In the evening of the end of the 12th lunar month, outside the residence of Zhang Yushang, the local head of the village in Wanyan Township, Qingzi County, Muzhu, the light of the torch illuminated the snowy wilderness. The refugees gathered from the surrounding towns and villages stood in the wind and snow like zombies, with ragged clothes, pale faces, and thin bodies, and there was no end in sight. Qingzi County produces a lot of bamboo paper, which is famous in the north and south of Daewoo. It is a very common thing in the study of rich people, but no one knows how much blood and sweat of barefoot people are hidden behind this simple Qingzi bamboo paper. Because of its rich production of bamboo paper, Qingzi County has always been a focus of government extortion, and it has been overwhelmed in the past. In the autumn, a flood hit Qingzi County very hard, and most of the workshops and houses were destroyed. The people who could not escape suffered heavy casualties and are still homeless today. The imperial court, which had been paying taxes every year, did not send a single grain of food to save lives. At this critical moment, the village head Zhang Yushang was still collecting head taxes from house to house. If they could not pay, they would be beaten with sticks. The family was gone, and the people were gone, so why should they pay the head tax? The local people did not know that the village head was also forced to collect taxes by the upper level with a knife. They only saw Zhang Yushang's ugly face of collecting silver and grain from house to house with a list of yeoman runners, who had no worries about food and clothing. The people either starved and froze in the deep mountains and old forests, protecting the last bit of food in their hands, or fled and became beggars and refugees, but their roots were in Qingzi County. Where could they escape? Their ancestors did not escape when the officials of Diqi ruled here 100 years ago. Why should they escape now? The pent-up resentment and the despair of being in danger of losing their lives have reached a peak in the hearts of the people of Qingzi County. And today, someone vented their anger for them. Sun Qian is back. Kill Zhang Yushang. Sun Qian was born in Qingzi County. When he was young, he was quite famous in the world. He was also a figure from Qingzi County. Most of the people in Qingzi County have heard of Sun Qian's name, and many people have seen him when they were young. Later, it was heard that Sun Qian committed a murder. In order to avoid being arrested by the court, he ran to the Hongshan Lake area and became a bandit. When the flood occurred in autumn, many desperate people in Qingzi County also ran to Hongshan Lake for refuge, and Hongshan Water Village also accepted them. Sun Qian peeled people's skin, tied up hostages and blackmailed wealthy businessmen. He was obviously an unforgivable evil man, but for the elders and villagers of Qingzi County, how could he be as evil as the court? At least when they were starving and cold and had nowhere to go, it was Sun Qian who gave them a bite of food, not the court. Today, Sun Qian came back and did something that the local people wanted to do but didn't dare to do, killing Zhang Yushang's family of 12 and hanging them on the gate. The ugly face that had once robbed and plundered people now appeared in front of nearly 1,000 people, dripping with blood. The tall and thin Sun Qian held a bloody knife in his hand, and behind him were nearly 100 men with murderous eyes. The elite water villagers who had escaped from Hongshan Lake stood outside the Zhang family's mansion, wearing yellow scarves on their heads and raising big flags. Sun Qian stood on the high platform, holding a head in his hand and said loudly, "The emperor calls us subjects. Have you ever seen a father forcefully ask for money and food when his son is about to starve or freeze to death? We pay money and food every year. These are all our blood and sweat. What did the emperor do with our blood and sweat? He gave it to rich squires and dignitaries, so that they could live in fine clothes and live happily, chatting about romantic poems and songs. Even living is a luxury for us now, but no one has ever looked at us. We only need a handful of rice. As long as a handful of rice, our son will not die, and our parents will not die. We paid so much money and food before, when parents, wives and children were starving to death. What did those officials do? They were still eating, drinking and having fun in the city, and even blocked the city gate to prevent us from entering, not even letting us pick up leftovers. Why can they stop working and sit at home and enjoy their happiness? Why do we have to work hard year after year to provide them with food, drink, and enjoyment? They all have only one head and two hands. Why are their lives more valuable than ours? Are princes, generals, and prime ministers born to be successful? Old General Su was just a butcher back then, and he was even meaner than us. He could split the territory and become a prince, so why should we suffer such arrogance here? We can't survive anymore. Why should we just wait here to die? I, Sun Qian, commit murder, set fires, and do all kinds of evil. I am not a good person. But I, Sun Qian, was born in Qingzi County. I will never let my parents down. You gave me a mouthful of rice and a bowl of water back then, and I can give you a life back now. I killed Zhang Yushang for you. The court doesn't care about you and me. We went to the city to rob if we had no food or clothes to wear. We robbed from rich people's houses. Those are ours. They are the robbers and bandits. They forced us. Passionate and passionate, a few words touched the pain of everyone in the audience without any bias. The hungry and cold people could no longer bear the grievances in their hearts at this moment. Their emotions were gradually infected, and they screamed and cried loudly. What does the peace of the world have to do with them who are desperate? Their lives are already in jeopardy. All they want is a handful of rice. If the court doesn't give it to them, then they will give it to the court. A spark that burns everything. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 568. At the end of the 12th lunar month and a few days before the new year, Sun Qian raised his arms and shouted in Wanyan Township and lit a fire. Sun Qian was not the only one who started the fire in Jiangnan Road. At almost the same moment, people in dozens of towns and counties in Jiuzhou, Muzhou and other places incited the refugees to rise up. These people did not rush into villages and towns and then disperse, but in a very short period of time, they gathered countless people with long-standing grievances and gathered in the countryside near Qingzi County. They called themselves rebels and distinguished their ranks with headscarves. Along the way, houses were burned down, children of gold and silk were robbed, and civilians with families were turned into refugees, forcing them to join the rebel army. Under the leadership of the rebels, the refugees invaded counties and towns where all city gate guards had been evacuated. They went to the armory to pick up the ordnance that had been prepared, and to the granary to remove the overflowing grain. With food and clothing, they were hungry and cold. The people heard the news and responded, all gathered together, and expanded at an alarming rate. The city of Hangzhou, which is more than 200 miles away, seems to have not received news of the Muzhou uprising. It is still busy raising money, food, and annual tribute to send to Chang'an. It neither sends troops to suppress nor appease. In this state of neglect, the rebel army, one can only imagine how far it can develop in a short period of time. In the middle reaches of the Fen River, on the river near Taiyuan, the building boat docked briefly for supplies, and then quietly left under the cover of night. The wedding room on the second floor of the building is filled with incense. A turtle-head copper stove is burning in the room. There are also happy words on the wall. Various gold utensils are also placed on the desk, covered with red cloth, and the decoration is very festive. There was a dim light burning on the desk beside the window. Xiao Qi, wearing a black gauze nightgown, sat quietly at the desk, reading the letter that had just been delivered to the Xiao family's secret pile. The letter was written by Xiao Ting, who has become the head of the Xiao family. Huainan is the gateway to Jiangnan. Although it is far away from Muzhou, the Xiao family has been rooted in Jiangnan for thousands of years, so it is impossible not to receive any news. According to Xiao Ting's description, a group of organized bandits appeared in Muzhou, with more than 1,000 people, burning, killing and looting everywhere. The government was slow to respond and failed to suppress it with all its strength. The uncles in the Xiao family felt something was fishy and asked Xiao Qi if what opinion. Xiao Qi read the letter carefully, was silent for a moment, and then shook her head. Based on the information she has now received, King Wu has obtained the Jade Seal, and the next step must be to threaten Songji's throne. But trying to mobilize hundreds of thousands of refugees and Daio's regular army to fight head-on is tantamount to wishful thinking. Since the king of Wu himself did not come forward, but let the gangsters lead the uprising, it shows that the king of Wu did not want to use force to fight the moth into the flame. According to her calculations, she probably wanted to sit back and watch the rebel army expand to a size that was difficult to end, and then use it to impeach Songji. The refugees were caused by excessive taxes and excessive taxes. Songji could not get rid of this blame. However, the whole Jiangnan was in civil strife, and it was difficult to bring down the king of a country. Even if Songji couldn't end it, he could at most make his crime known, and then dispatch heavy troops from northern Xinjiang to go south to quell the rebellion. Therefore, internal troubles are not enough, we also need external troubles. Xiao Qi stood up, opened the window, looked north against the cold wind, and frowned. Daio's biggest foreign threat was the northern Qi dynasty. If the whole of Jiangnan was in civil strife and the Qi army in northern Xinjiang entered the pass, half of Dao's country would be gone. Even Song Ji, a great leader in Wentao and Wulu, would not be able to withstand such a serious crime and would be punished on the spot. He became what many people call a coward and a tyrant. The next thing is simple. It has happened in history. The princes from all walks of life contacted the princes and generals and worked together to depose the emperor and establish a new emperor. As long as more than half of the 5 major surnames and the 7 vassal kings insist on deposing the emperor, Song Ji will not abdicate even if he does not abdicate. You will become a real loner. This method will inevitably drag the entire world into the quagmire of war. If the northern border is lost, millions of people may be killed by the sword. It is obviously an unforgivable crime against nature and justice. But Xiao Qi has no doubt whether the vassal king can do such a thing. He can definitely do it. Those in power only consider their own interests, and the slightest kindness to women will cost the lives of the entire clan. Take Xiao Qi herself as an example. She is now the daughter-in-law of the Su family. Song Ji's move to cut down the vassal clan was to drive out the Su family. Even if there is no chance to take action in the current generation, it is very likely that her daughter-in-law will be killed in a few decades or 100 years. The children and grandchildren are all dead. As long as this knife is raised, the two sides will fall into an infinite chain of suspicion that will never stop. Xiao Qi knew very clearly that one day, only one of the Su family and the Song family would survive. It was only a matter of time or night. If that day came, whoever was merciful would definitely deserve death. In order to keep the family alive, so what if the world is in chaos? Your Song family's world is gone, what does it have to do with me? Although King Wu's surname is Song, since the enfeoffment of Jiangnan, he and the Chang'an city clan have become two families. They are not much different from King Su. It is not unusual at all to do this. However, in the current situation, Xiao Qi does not need to consider which side she is on. Because even if Song Ji abdicates, the throne cannot fall on the lineage of King Su. No matter whether King Wu is the emperor, King Chu, or King Wei, after he takes office, he will still think about how to reduce the Su family's vassal. This is the Song family's. The housework has nothing to do with the Su family, so there is nothing wrong with watching them commit suicide. Maybe we can wait until Chang'an City and the various vassal kings are both defeated, and then let the Ziliang army come out to harvest. Xiao Qi frowned and thought for a moment, then shook her head. Chang'an City really couldn't withstand the pressure from various vassal kings and the northern Qi dynasty. It would definitely draw the Ziliang army to come out to suppress the rebellion. How could the Su family sit in the rear and recharge their batteries? Counterinsurgency. Thinking of this, Xiao Qi squinted her eyes slightly, a light flashed in her eyes, as if she thought of something very important. Dong dong. After a long time, there was a knock on the door of the wedding room, and it was opened without being summoned. Xiao Xiang who was wearing a red nightgown, held a tray in her hand, lazily closed the door with her shoulders, and walked slowly towards the desk. Xiao Qi was rubbing her painful forehead when she saw her sister come in, put away the papers on the table, and smiled a little. Xiang why are you here? Are you so itchy that you can't sleep at night? As biological sisters, they have shared a bed together and served Su Buletin Ling, so they are no longer young girls. Naturally, these secrets of best friends are not too taboo. It had been almost 2 months since she and Su Buling had been separated. It was easy to imagine how Xiao Xiang who had become accustomed to detoxifying and paying off debts, came to be here. Staying alone in the empty boudoir was even more difficult than being in the palace, so she comforted herself with golden quail eggs. She felt something was wrong again, so she could only run to Xiao Qi's house in the middle of the night, talk nonsense, and let her sister, who had been serious and calm since childhood, supervise her not to make mistakes, lest Su Buring came back and found that she couldn't help but use quail eggs, thus making fun of her. Xiao Qi has been sharp-minded since she was a child and can see her sister's thoughts, and she often makes fun of her. Xiao Xiang'er had a cheerful temperament, so when faced with her sister's teasing, she didn't care at all and retorted. Yes, after all, Su Buling and I have gotten used to it for more than a year. It's not like you. It's only been a few times and you haven't even tasted it? Of course you're not hungry. At most, these dirty words made Lu Hongluan so embarrassed that she dared not meet anyone. Neither sister was a good person, so Xiao Qi didn't care and turned to look at the tray in Xiao Xiang'er's hand. The tray contained razors, paintbrushes, paints, and other objects with unknown functions. Xiao Qi stood up, sat down next to the carved soft couch, picked up the teacup and took a sip. What weird stuff are you doing again? Xiao Xiang'er has been fond of strange and obscene skills since she was a child. She is very good at craftsmanship and has made a lot of messy things. Xiao Qi, as her sister, naturally knows this. However, these are all ordinary objects and there is nothing special about them. Xiao Xiang'er's almond-shaped eyes were slightly smiling. She placed the tray on the small case, and then rubbed Xiao Qi's shoulders with her hands. Sister, I was reading some miscellaneous books a few days ago and saw some more elegant painting methods, which are to paint on beauties. I'm very interested. Please let me try it. Xiao Qi was puzzled. She thought about it carefully and found that there were indeed allusions in some unofficial history books about the libertine using the body of a beautiful woman as his canvas. She frowned and said, "What's the point of trying this? You're not a man. When people draw pictures on beauties, the pictures are not pictures." Xiao Xiang'er raised her hand and pressed Xiao Qi's shoulder, pushing her softly. "Oh, it's okay on the boat anyway, just let me try, good sister. Why don't you go find Hongluan? She is also a beauty. Don't you have a good relationship with her? That jealous person is so conservative, how could he possibly agree to me?" Well, Xiao Qi had no choice but to lie down on the couch and stretch out her arms. "I really like you. Hurry up and paint. I still have to wash it. It's been a few days." Xiao Xiang'er's pretty face was filled with a smile. She quickly moved her sister's legs up, let her lie flat on the couch, and then untied her nightgown. Xiao Qi noticed something was wrong and raised her hand to hold her skirt. "What are you doing?" Xiao Xiang'er's eyes were quite serious and she pulled her hand away. "I've already told you to draw on your body. Your arms are so thin, how can you draw bamboo?" Xiao Qi pursed her lips and agreed. Anyway, she could wash it later. She didn't hesitate and lay down again. However, after Xiao Xiang'er took off her nightgown and exposed her smooth skin, she didn't go for the paintbrush. Instead, she picked up the razor and put it under Xiao Qi's belly. Ah! Seeing this, Xiao Qi turned up and held her sister's wrist, anxious and angry. "Damn girl, are you out of your mind? What are you doing with the razor? Murdering your own sister is not okay." Xiao Xiang'er blinked her apricot eyes. "Aren't you painting? How can you paint with hair? You dash." Xiao Qi's face turned red. She closed her nightgown and was about to get up. "Go back to sleep, Su Buling will be back in 2 days, let him see you messing around. Bah, you two don't have a good thing." Seeing how fiercely her sister resisted, Xiao Xiang'er stopped insisting and said with a smile, Okay, I'll throw away the razor and just draw, okay? Please, I'll give it a try." With a bit of embarrassment in her eyes, Xiao Qi snatched the razor and threw it into the box under the small case. She glared at Xiao Xiang'er for a few times before lying down again. This time Xiao Xiang'er was finally honest. She took the paintbrush seriously and drew a pattern of a flying phoenix spreading its wings on Xiao Qi's body. She also wrote 5 small words: "Kikai is the best behaved." The position is self-explanatory. After finishing the painting, Xiao Xiang'er's eyes showed a bit of cunning. He coughed slightly, put away the brush, nodded with satisfaction, "Not bad, very beautiful." Then he picked up the tray and walked out. Xiaoqi looked down and felt confused. She stood up, closed her dress, and walked to the next door bathing room. "Aren't you going to rest here?" "No, sister, please go to bed early." "Oh." Xiaoqi frowned slightly, feeling that something was wrong, but Xiang'er's temperament had always been like this, so she couldn't explain why. After a while, in the steamy bathroom, Xiaoqi's slightly shy and angry scolding came. "Xiang'er, come here, why can't you wash this thing off?" "Oh, it will fade on its own in a few days. Su Buletinling will be back in a few days." Why didn't you tell me earlier?" "Sister, you didn't even ask, what should I do? I'm really worried about my sister." You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Prince is Very Fierce. Author, Guan Zi. Chapter 569. The wolf guards gathered in Yuzhu and set up a huge net to search for Su Buling's whereabouts. Traces of wolf guards and soldiers can be seen everywhere in rural towns, and the main water and land routes are tightly blocked. However, this kind of blockade can only block the common people. For the martial arts masters who fly over the walls, it is useless. The only way to catch them is by dozens of falcons hovering in the sky. After Zhongli Jiju left the inn, he and Ning Qingyi headed towards Taiyuan. Zhongli Jiju was an expert at playing with birds, and it was easy to evade the pursuit of several falcons. He soon left the jurisdiction of Yuzhu and stopped in Linqiu County, waiting for Su Buling to come and join him. Linqiu County is just outside the border of Yuzhu. Although it is also blocked by the army and under martial law, the army does not deal with the Jianghu people and does not know much about the methods of the Jianghu people. The wolf guards specialize in dealing with the Jianghu people. The lack of manpower only blocks Yuzhu. Within the prefecture, wolf guards were not dispatched to Linqiu County, and patrols here were much looser. On a small street in the slums of Linqiu County, the local Jianghu people were huddled in various inns, waiting for the court to crack down. Gulan wine shops and gambling houses were closed, and they were quieter and more disciplined than the private school where master taught, for fear that attract the attention of officers and soldiers. In the guest room of the inn, Zhongli Jiju was wearing a long aqua dress, with her hands folded on her waist, walking back and forth, occasionally looking at the little sparrow standing on the roof blowing the cold wind outside the window, with a slightly anxious look in her eyes. Ning Qingyi lay on the pillow, with the wooden box containing the jade seal at hand, quietly closing her eyes and concentrating. Although the two were women, they also knew the importance of the imperial seal. In order not to be noticed, they stayed with the imperial seal all the way. They also slept together at night and took turns standing guard to avoid mistakes. They were dedicated. At this time, Ning Qingyi was supposed to be resting. He saw Zhongli Jiju walking around in the room. Ning Qingyi was obviously affected and couldn't sleep. He turned his head and said in a cold voice, "You've been walking all morning, aren't you tired?" Zhongli Jiju was panicking. She was embarrassed to talk to Ning Qingyi, but the other party spoke first. She hurriedly walked to the bed and sat down in front of her. "Qingyi, Su Buling said he was coming back after getting rid of the pursuers. He has been out for 4 days, will something happen to him? Chu Chu is still in front of him." Ning Qingyi was born with a cold personality. Although she was a bit upright, she was never impatient in dealing with things. She said calmly, "The wolf guard is still patrolling, which means they haven't found the person they are looking for. We are worried when the officers and soldiers outside have withdrawn. The officers and soldiers outside are still there, so why are we anxious?" Zhongli Jiju knew this truth, but there was no news for a few days. Her beloved husband and apprentice were both outside. How could she not be worried? For a moment, she could only sigh and sit in front of her shaking her legs. Ning Qingyi was unable to sleep, and turned her head to look at Zhongli Jiju's back. Her buttocks were round, her skirt was tight, her waist was slender, and the curves she drew were beautiful and full of energy. It was so tense that even the woman looked at it with envy. Ning Qingyi lowered her head and looked at herself, with a hint of nothing more than that in her eyes, and said softly, "Fidgeting, missing your man." Zhongli Jiju stiffened slightly. His face turned slightly red after being teased by the junior. He sat up straighter and pretended to be calm. "Qingyi, I'm a woman, and if I have a man I like, it's not immoral, right?" Ning Qingyi snorted lightly. "Of course it doesn't count, but how do you explain it to Chu Chu?" Zhongli Jiju stopped talking. Although he wanted to refute the matter of Ning Qingyi and Ning Yu's marriage, if he said this, Ning Qingyi would definitely explode, and her husband would definitely kill her when he came back, so he could only swallow his anger and act like a mute. Ning Qingyi was indeed cold on the outside, but she was still quite normal inside. When she saw that Zhongli Jiju was silent, she thought for a moment and thought that maybe she had embarrassed Zhongli Jiju by not opening a certain pot, so she spoke again. "I don't mean to look down on you. It's normal for a woman to have a man she likes. There are not many good men in the world, and Su Buring is one of them. You still have good taste." Zhongli Jiju glanced secretly and saw that Ning Qingyi's expression was serious and he was not jealous, so he said with a smile, "Yes, Miss Ning has better taste. Why do I have good eyesight? I am just blind, so I kidnapped Su Buling as a helpless young master. If I had seen it correctly at that time, so many messy things would not have happened. But the kindness of a drop of water is repaid by a spring of water. I still remember his kindness in saving me, although his purpose is a bit impure and he covets my cough dash." Zhongli Jiju heard that it was a bit funny, but she didn't dare to laugh and nodded seriously. When Ning Qingyi said this, he thought of something and turned his head. "By the way, I forgot to tell you. When I was in Laoding County, Su Danking painted a picture for me. I am now a bagui, and I guess my reputation will be spread throughout the world in a few days." Zhongli Jiju was stunned for a moment, and the pain that had been rooted in her heart for many years reappeared in her mind, but she quickly suppressed it and said with a smile, "Well deserved, congratulations. I have given up this idea a long time ago and will not argue with your master." Ning Qingyi sighed softly, "Just don't argue, otherwise I'm afraid you won't be able to bear it." "Huh?" Zhongli Jiju turned around, slightly confused. "What can't you stand?" Ning Qingyi's cold face was full of seriousness. "You and my master have been arguing for many years, but in the end, my master is the Bakui, my master's apprentice is the Bakui, your apprentice is also the Bakui, but you are not the Bakui. This it would make most people angry to death, let alone you." Zhongli Jiju's expression froze. He took a deep breath, suppressed the overwhelming jealousy in his heart, and said with a smile, "Qingyi, I can't speak, well, I'll just say less words from now on. I'll tell you the truth, aren't you going to argue? Are you still angry about this? How could it be? Am I angry? Haha, why am I angry?" Zhongli Jiju stood up, walked around the house a few times, then said, "I'll go down to eat something," and ran out of the house. Ning Qingyi raised her slender eyebrows, adjusted her position to sleep more comfortably, and breathed a sigh of relief. Much cleaner. The sun and the moon alternate, and the time soon arrives in the afternoon. In the countryside outside Linqiao County, Su Buling and Nightingale stopped their horses and raised their hands to say goodbye to Lu Beiming, who was escorting them along the way. "After coming out of Pingwu, I was wary of falcons. I just avoided the wolf guards without fighting. The road was much easier. Apart from hiding in Tibet and wading through mountains and rivers, there was nothing much to say. Lu Beiming was riding on a horse with a long sword hanging on his waist. He had been a swordsman all his life. He did not show the courtesy of ordinary people in the market. He just raised his hand gently. Take good care of yourself along the way. Say hello to Suyu and me. I hope I can have a drink with him at the same table in my lifetime. Su Buling stood under the horse and saluted with a smile. Uncle, I will get married when I get back. Do you really want to go to Suzhou with us? Lu Beiming really wanted to go. As Su Buling's biological uncle, why didn't he want to go to his sister's grave to pay homage, but the court was between the two families, so he had to hide his head even when he saw Su Buling, so he could arrange to attend his nephew's wedding openly. Lu Beiming shook his head. Your Majesty, Jianghu people pay blood debts with blood. It is ungentleman not to avenge a grudge. The Lu family, will settle the vengeance on our own. You and Suyu don't have to worry about it. Zhongshan Shiji is what you should care about. It's time to say goodbye. If we can meet again, I just hope that I don't have to hide around like now. You can only do this, I can't do it. Su Buletinling was silent for a moment, then raised his hand and saluted. Lu Beiming reined in his horse and turned towards the east. Before leaving, he looked back at Zhongli Chuchu who was standing behind Su Buling. Chuchu is a good girl, don't let her down. Su Buling was stunned for a moment and looked back, but Zhongli Chuchu's expression froze and he lowered his head with a look of I don't know anything. Okay, I will follow my uncle's instructions. Lu Beiming nodded slightly and rode away without stopping. Nightingale stood in front of her with a bit of reluctance in her eyes. Master, I have only scratched the surface of the Lu family's 36 swords. It would be great if I could stay longer. Su Buring smiled and led the horse from the mountains to Linkai County. There will be plenty of opportunities in the future, so don't rush for a while. Let's go and meet Jeju and the others first. Zhongli Chuchu was about to see her master, and her mood gradually became uncomfortable again. She distanced herself a little further from Su Buling, and walked in front of Nightingale. Su Buring was a little worried about the quarrel between master and apprentice, but he still felt sorry for his silly wife, so he immediately advised. Chu-chu, there must be a lot of spies in this town. If you have anything to say later, go into the house and chat slowly with Jeju, so as not to attract the spies' attention. This was obviously because he was worried that Zhongli Chuchu would not be able to control his emotions and would quarrel with his master. Zhongli Chuchu put on a veil to cover up her foreign appearance, and her eyes returned to the calmness they had when they first met. Don't worry, I won't quarrel with the master. It's not easy for her either. She's already a lot of age. If she finds a lover, can I, the apprentice, stop her? Well. Su Buling nodded, feeling even more uneasy. Following the mark left by Jeju, the three of them passed through the gap blocked by Linkai County and came to the town. They quickly found a small inn in a slum area. The inn is in an alley. The surrounding buildings are simple and there are almost no people inside. Not long after I walked in, the little sparrow standing on the roof, almost freezing and stupid, flew over as if it were a relative, and landed on the big head of the horse chasing the wind. You can obviously feel from the birds, why are you here, it means I'm freezing to death. Nightingale hurriedly ran over, held the shivering little sparrow and touched it a few times. Su Buling and Zhongli Chuchu came outside the inn, but before they went in, they suddenly found a beautiful woman in a water blue dress deep in the alley next to the inn, standing alone in the corner, kicking the wall with her embroidered shoes, and chewing in her mouth. What are you thinking about? Bakui is amazing, sister, I'm just unlucky. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 570. The expressions of Zhongli Chuchu and Su Buling froze, especially Zhongli Chuchu. She thought her master was worried about her safety, but she didn't expect that the first thing she heard when she came back was to fight for the 8th leader. Su Buling realized something was wrong and coughed quickly. Ahem. When Zhongli Jiju heard a familiar voice, his kicking movement at the wall suddenly froze, and he silently took it back. Then he turned around, with tears in his eyes. The worries and longings of the past few days were all written on his face, and he hurriedly ran to in front of him. A bear hug hugged Zhongli Chuchu. Chuchu, just hope you're okay, you're finally back. The expression is indeed sincere, but the change from before to after is so drastic, it is obviously a bit fake. Zhongli Chuchu stood there, breathless as she was hugged by her master, and twisted a few times. You hugged the wrong person, hug your man. Ah! Zhongli Jiju's pretty face froze, her worry and longing turned into grievances, and she felt a little embarrassed. She let go of her hand and looked into Zhongli's beautiful eyes. Chuchu, I was wrong, he and I. Zhongli Chuchu turned around and walked into the inn. I'm tired and want to go up and rest. You guys can chat. Need. Zhongli Jiju followed for 2 steps, and Chuchu went upstairs without looking back. Zhongli Jiju did not dare to offend her heartbroken disciple. She could only turn her eyes to Su Buling, her eyes turning into annoyance, and she raised her hand and pinched her husband's waist. How did you coax you? It's all your fault. What should I do now? If Chuchu ignores me, I will ignore you for the rest of my life. Su Buling was also helpless. It was not easy for him to persuade Chuchu to come back. On the way back these 2 days, Chuchu almost broke his back. But these words were obviously useless. He looked around, raised his arms around Jiju's waist, lowered his head and kissed her red lips twice. Good boy, just go up and talk to Chuchu and you'll be fine. I was beaten outside for several days and my whole body was covered in injuries. I was choked until I lay down. Zhongli Jiju originally wanted to hide, but stopped when he heard these words. He held Su Buling's wrist and examined it carefully, his eyes narrowed. Where did you get hurt? The trauma is on the body. You should go and accompany Chuchu first. Seeing that Su Buling was fine, Zhongli Jiju felt relieved. The apprentice was more important and quickly entered the inn. But after struggling downstairs for a long time, Zhongli Jiju was a little afraid to go see Chuchu. It was impossible not to go, so she could only run into the kitchen and make a bowl of noodles and carry it upstairs. Zhongli Chuchu found a room in the inn, put down her baggage, and sat on a chair with her arms folded, as if a parent was waiting for their child to apologize. After a while, the door was gently pushed open. Zhongli Jiju smiled like a flower, holding a steaming bowl of noodles in her hand, closed the door with her foot, and said softly. Chuchu, are you tired these days? Eat something to replenish your body quickly. Look, your face has become thinner. Zhongli Chuchu sat on the chair without moving, looked out the window, and said in a calm voice. You can make up for it yourself. I accompany Su Buling to fight and kill during the day, and I have to serve Su Buling at night. How can I bear this burden? Zhongli Jiju's face turned red, he put the noodle bowl on the small table next to his apprentice, sat down next to him, and looked away. Chuchu, why did you say that about master? Zhongli Chuchu folded his arms and turned his head to look at his own master. Then what should I say to you? Just to compare with Ningyu he, you can even compare with this kind of thing, what else can't you compare with? In the future, if Ningyu he has 2 sons, will you agree to it? 4 children? Or 8? Oops dash. Zhongli Jiju was anxious and shy, but did not dare to get angry, so she whispered softly. I'm not competing with Ningyu. No. Su Buletin told you. This bastard, a little bit, but not entirely. You know my temperament and I like to be competitive, but not to that extent. You don't want to compete with Ning Qingyi, and I'm just broken. After saying a few words, I still care about you more in my heart. Do you care about me? You asked me to wear less clothes to hook up with Su Buling. I took off my clothes and exposed half of my buttocks, and you pulled me back again. Why am I shameless? You didn't say I could go? You didn't let me. If I take it off, will I take it off? Then what? Didn't you say that you took off your clothes in Suzhou? You. Okay, okay. Zhongli Jiju had nothing to say and glanced at his apprentice. I'll admit my mistake. Just scold me. I still care about you. Zhongli Chuchu's clothes were heaving up and down, and after staring at his master for a moment, he turned around and took the noodle bowl, picked up the chopsticks with force, and hummed. Let's forget this matter. Let me make it clear to you. I can't call Su Buling daddy. From now on, we can talk about our own affairs. I treat him as a friend. You can call him whatever you like. Zhongli Jiju was happy in her heart, but she didn't dare to show it on her face. She raised her head slightly. Okay, well, Chu-Chu, do you like Su Buling? Zhongli Chu-Chu slapped his chopsticks on the table. What do I like? I don't care about him at all. I am angry because I think you are not living up to expectations. In what way are you worse than others? Do you deserve to be cheating on yourself? He gave you half a point. No. I didn't give you anything, so you gave me everything you could. If he asks you to be a kid, who are you going to talk to? Zhongli Jiju clutched her skirt. Naturally she didn't dare to say anything about forcing Su Buling to pay homage to the church. She looked a little innocent. His martial arts skills are so high, I can't defeat him. Did he use force on you? It's not. That's what you took the initiative. You used to have a lot of evil ideas and never suffered any losses in doing things. Why are you so generous this time? Not to mention the main concubine, it's hard to say whether you can get the concubine now. Maybe when you get to the palace, you will become a nanny and provide services to others. Ning Yu's baby is even fatter than your baby, ouch. Weird and strange. Zhongli Jiju was almost crying with anger, but she didn't dare to talk back. After all, she did give it away without getting anything. Now she was embarrassed to raise her head when she saw Ning Qingyi, let alone Ning Yuhe. Listening to his disciples scolding, Zhongli Jiju could not say a single word other than twitching her hair around her ears. Other side. Su Buling went upstairs and did not dare to observe the Shura battlefield between master and apprentice. He shook his head and sighed, and went to Qingyi's room to visit for a while. The room was close to the back alley, and it was very quiet inside. It seemed that they hadn't noticed that they were back. Su Buling raised his hand and pushed open the door. He wanted to go in and say hello to Qingyi, but when he raised his eyes, he saw Ning Qingyi lying on the quilt with her eyes closed, sleeping soundly. Su Buling wanted to exit, but Ning Qingyi did not let down her guard in her sleep. When she heard the door open, she had already grasped the snow-white sword at her side and turned her head to look at the door. Eyes facing each other. Su Buling smiled softly, entered the room, closed the door, and said, "Are you resting? I accidentally woke you up." Ning Qingyi woke up out of instinct. After seeing that Su Buling was not in danger, her thoughts gradually returned to her mind and she woke up completely. She sat up and frowned. "When did you come back?" After sitting up, the thick quilt on his body slipped off, revealing his white back and white belly band embroidered with lotus flowers in front of him. It was exactly the same as the one on Yuhi's body, and the scale was not far different. From the side, the peaks and mountains were beautiful, and his waist was like a willow tree. Coupled with the already cold and unparalleled face, it is quite sultry. Su Buling saw Qingyi without clothes for the first time. He really didn't expect that he was so confident under the white skirt. He was stunned for a moment, then turned around quickly and said sternly, "Qingyi, what are you doing?" Ning Qingyi usually sleeps with her clothes on when walking alone, but with little Sparrow and Juju watching outside, she can feel comfortable and won't cause trouble for herself. Seeing Su Buling's reaction at this time, he lowered his head in confusion before remembering that he was not wearing anything. Ning Qingyi's cheeks suddenly turned red, and she lay back down suddenly, almost breaking the bed board. She wrapped the quilt around her body and scolded coldly. "You bastard, get out of here." Su Buling coughed slightly, but he had no choice but to admit that he had taken advantage, turned around and walked out. But before she went out, Ning Qingyi thought of something again, frowned and said, "Wait a minute." Su Buling stopped and looked at Qingyi. "What's wrong?" Ning Qingyi huddled in the quilt, only showing her cold face, and frowned. "How is Chu Chu?" Although Ning Qingyi is straight-tempered, she obviously cares about her friends, which can be seen from her attitude towards Manzi. Su Buling smiled and said, "Chu Chu is fine, she's back." Ning Qingyi frowned, glanced at Su Buling, and thought for a moment. "I've been staying with Zhongli Juju these past few days and paid close attention. She seems to really like you and is not coveting your power. Don't worry." Su Buling blinked, slightly surprised. "Why are you paying attention to this?" Ning Qingyi didn't know why she paid attention to this. After thinking about it, she turned over and faced inside, leaving Su Buling with the back of her head. "You are my junior brother. I just need to pay attention to you. I still owe you a favor, you are a disciple, get out of here." Su Buling nodded with a smile, paused for a moment, and said softly, "Have a good rest." Squeak. The door closed and there was no more sound. Ning Qingyi faced inside, the quilt was tightly wrapped, her hand came out from under the quilt, holding the snow-white sword and looked at it twice, then she closed her eyes with peace of mind and fell into sleep.